The cold night air pressed heavily against his skin as Daniel rushed through the nearly deserted platform. He glanced at his watch. 11:48 p.m. The last train. He had missed it too many times before, but tonight he couldn't afford to. A deadline at work had kept him late, and every bone in his body ached for home, for the solace of his small, cluttered apartment. The distant hum of approaching tracks vibrated beneath his feet, a low rumble growing louder as the train emerged from the tunnel. The headlights cut through the fog, an eerie glow casting long shadows over the platform. As the doors slid open, Daniel stepped inside, noting the dim, almost sickly lighting. The interior felt older than it should. Faded, cracked seats, flickering fluorescent lights, the faint scent of mildew. He looked around. Sparse passengers dotted the carriage, all sitting still, their faces hidden in shadow. No one made eye contact. No one moved. An odd hush blanketed the space, heavier than the silence of an ordinary late-night commute. Daniel's unease prickled at the back of his neck. He took a seat near the middle, gripping his briefcase tightly. The train started moving, smoothly at first, then faster, the landscape outside blurring into darkness. Minutes passed. The usual announcement for the next station never came. Daniel frowned, checking his watch. The train should have reached the next stop by now. His eyes darted to the other passengers, each staring blankly ahead. The hum of the train on the tracks seemed louder than normal, pressing into his ears. Something was wrong. He stood up, gripping a nearby pole for balance as he made his way toward the front of the carriage. "Excuse me," he muttered to a middle-aged man in a gray coat, but the man didn't respond. His eyes glazed over, didn't even flicker. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Hey," he said louder, tapping the man's shoulder. Nothing. It was like trying to wake a statue. Panic began to simmer in his chest. He moved to the next passenger, a young woman with long, dark hair. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice more urgent. She didn't blink, her gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Something was very wrong. He rushed to the door at the end of the carriage, gripping the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. The train sped faster, the outside world a swirling void. He pounded on the door, the noise swallowed by the hum of the train. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted, turning back to the passengers. They remained motionless, like wax figures, their silence pressing in on him. Then, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, everything plunged into darkness. When they came back on, the passengers' heads had all turned, just slightly, but enough to face him. Their eyes, hollow and dark, bore into him. Daniel stumbled back, his heart hammering. "What is this?" he whispered, sweat prickling his skin. The train's rhythm changed. The sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks grew more aggressive, a shrill screech that set his teeth on edge. He tried to steady his breathing, searching the carriage for an exit. His eyes landed on the emergency stop button near the door. He lunged for it, slamming his fist against the panel. Nothing. The button didn't even depress. It was like it was painted on. He turned back to the passengers, but they had returned to their original positions, staring blankly ahead. The flickering lights seemed to dim further, the air growing colder. A low whisper echoed through the carriage, so faint he couldn't make out the words. Daniel's head snapped around, searching for the source. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices layered on top of each other. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere. His mind raced. He had to get off this train. But how? The doors were locked, the windows thick and unyielding. He moved to the next carriage, hoping to find an attendant, a conductor, someone. The door between carriages slid open with a groan, revealing another identical carriage, equally dim and filled with the same vacant-eyed passengers. As he stepped through, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, trying to reopen it, but it was sealed tight. The whispers followed him, growing louder. He clutched his head, trying to block out the noise, but it seeped into his mind, filling every corner. The passengers in this carriage turned their heads just like before, their eyes fixed on him. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence, thick and oppressive, pressed in. Then a voice, clear, deep, and hollow, spoke, though Daniel couldn't tell from where. "Face it," it said, the words echoing in his skull. "Face it." His breath came in shallow gasps. "Face what?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The train shuddered, the lights flickering again. Images flashed in his mind, memories distorted and fragmented. A woman's face crying, a car crumpled and smoking, his own hands shaking, covered in blood. "No," he muttered, pressing his palms to his temples. "No." The voice repeated, louder this time. "Face it." The train hurtled through the darkness, faster and faster, the screech of the tracks deafening. Daniel fell to his knees, the memories crashing over him. The accident, the screams, the guilt. He had buried it, locked it away, convinced himself he could forget. But this train, this endless, nightmarish ride, it was forcing him to confront what he had tried so hard to escape. He looked up, tears streaming down his face. The passengers were still, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. The train roared, the walls vibrating. Daniel knew, with a chilling certainty, that there was no way off this train until he faced the truth he had buried deep within. The train sped on, the screeching metal echoing like a relentless scream. Daniel's body trembled as he knelt on the cold, grimy floor of the carriage. The haunting voice still echoed in his mind. "Face it." The hollow-eyed passengers sat motionless, their silent stares drilling into him, waiting. For what? He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his breathing ragged. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the train. "What do you want from me?" No answer. Only silence, thick and suffocating. He forced himself to his feet, staggering to the next carriage door. His hands shook as he gripped the handle, but this door opened easily, sliding apart with an eerie hiss. Stepping through, he braced himself for more motionless passengers. But this carriage was empty. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. As he moved forward, the whispering returned, growing louder with each step. It wasn't random noise anymore. It felt like a chant, a ritual calling to him. His heart pounded in his chest. He had to keep moving. There had to be a way out. At the far end of the carriage, he saw a door different from the others. It was old, wooden, with a brass handle, out of place on this modern train. His pulse quickened. He approached, hesitating before reaching for the handle. His fingers trembled, and just as he was about to turn it, a sudden gust of cold air blew through the carriage, chilling him to the bone. He spun around. The passengers from the previous carriages were now standing in the doorway, filling the space, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They didn't move, but the air felt heavy with their presence, as though they were pressing in on him without taking a step. The voice echoed again, louder this time. "Face it." Daniel clenched his teeth. "Face what?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "I don't know what you want from me." Suddenly, the wooden door opened on its own, revealing a dark room beyond. A cold wind blew from the doorway, carrying the scent of burnt metal and something else, something familiar. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The room was small, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. A table stood in the center, and on it lay an object that made his heart stop. A cracked, blood-stained rearview mirror. The memories surged back, vivid and unstoppable. The accident, the twisted metal, the woman's face, her eyes wide with fear, her voice screaming his name. "No," Daniel whispered, backing away. I can't. The voice, closer now, whispered in his ear. "You must." Tears streamed down his face. He had buried it so deep, convinced himself it wasn't his fault. The drink hadn't impaired him, he had told himself. The other car had come out of nowhere, but deep down, he knew. The mirror showed him what he couldn't deny, the truth he had tried to forget. "I'm sorry," he choked, falling to his knees. "I didn't mean to. I didn't." The walls of the room began to close in, the flickering light growing brighter, almost blinding. The air thickened, pressing down on him like a weight. The passengers' whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices echoing his guilt. Face it. Accept it. The light swelled, and suddenly, everything went silent. Daniel's eyes blinked open. The train had stopped. He was sitting alone on a bench at a station, the early morning light filtering through the fog. The platform was empty. The train was gone. He stood, his body weak, his mind heavy. The memories were still there, but the weight was different. He could feel the guilt, the pain, but it wasn't crushing him anymore. The voice had been right. He had faced it, accepted it. A faint whisper echoed in the wind, almost comforting now. "You're free." Daniel took a deep breath, stepping off the platform. The train, the passengers, the endless loop, they had been his prison, a manifestation of his own denial and guilt. Now, as he walked into the morning light, he knew the journey was over, but the real journey, the one toward redemption, had just begun.